My childhood best friend proposed to my ex behind my back, but what came next made him wish he never did. Ethan here, 31 years old, and until 3 years ago, I thought I knew what loyalty meant. I grew up with my best friend Carlos from the time we were 6 years old, more like brothers than friends, really. From scraped knees on the playground to celebrating job promotions as adults, we had each other's backs through absolutely everything life threw at us. Or at least, that's what I believed until the day I walked into that engagement party and discovered exactly what kind of person he really was. Carlos and I had been inseparable since elementary school. We lived 3 houses apart on the same street, played on the same little league teams, went through awkward middle school phases together, and even ended up at the same college studying business. After graduation, we both landed jobs in the finance industry in our hometown and kept the tradition going of grabbing beers every Friday night to catch up on our weeks. We celebrated each other's successes without jealousy or competition. When Carlos got promoted to senior analyst before I did, I was genuinely happy for him. When I landed a better position at a different firm 6 months later, he threw me a congratulations party. We were each other's wingmen at bars, best men at family weddings, and the first people we called with good news or bad news. That's the friendship I thought I had when I met Isabella 3 years ago at a networking event downtown. She was absolutely stunning, the kind of woman who could stop conversations just by walking into a room. Long auburn hair, perfect makeup, designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She worked in marketing for luxury brands and had this sophisticated confidence that made me feel like I was punching above my weight class just by talking to her. When Isabella agreed to go out with me, I felt like I'd won the lottery. Our first date was at an upscale steakhouse that she'd suggested, and I didn't mind picking up the $200 tab because she seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, my family, my goals for the future. She laughed at my jokes and seemed impressed by my career trajectory in finance. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. Isabella was unlike anyone I'd ever dated, cultured, ambitious, beautiful. She knew about wine, art, expensive restaurants, all the sophisticated things I'd never been exposed to growing up in a middle-class family. She made me want to be a better version of myself, to work harder and achieve more so I could be worthy of someone like her. But gradually, things started to shift in ways that made me uncomfortable. Dates turned into shopping sprees where Isabella would model expensive clothes and jewelry, hinting about how much she loved certain pieces. Romantic surprises became expectations. If I didn't plan something elaborate and costly for her birthday or our anniversary, she'd get moody and distant for days. Isabella never directly asked me to buy her things, but she had subtle ways of making her desires known. She'd save items in online shopping carts and leave her laptop open so I could see them. She'd mention how much her friends' boyfriends spoiled them with expensive gifts. She'd get sad when she couldn't afford something she really wanted, talking about how hard it was to maintain her professional image on her marketing salary. I started using credit cards to keep up with her lifestyle expectations, telling myself it was an investment in our relationship. When she wanted to go to expensive concerts or weekend getaways at luxury resorts, I'd find a way to make it happen even if it meant going into debt. I convinced myself that she was worth the financial strain because she was encouraging me to live a more ambitious, successful life. The red flags became harder to ignore during our second year together. Isabella rarely contributed financially to our dates or trips, claiming she was saving for important career goals. She was vague about her job responsibilities and income, but somehow always needed my help covering expensive purchases. When I suggested cheaper date options or mentioned my own financial stress, she'd accuse me of not prioritizing our relationship. Most telling was how Isabella interacted with Carlos whenever we hung out as a group. She was always particularly charming and flirtatious with him, asking detailed questions about his work, his investments, his expensive car. She'd compliment his clothes, his apartment, his success in ways that felt excessive even for someone trying to be friendly with her boyfriend's best friend. At the time, I thought she was just trying to build good relationships with the important people in my life. Carlos made significantly more money than I did and lived a more luxurious lifestyle, so I figured Isabella was impressed by his success and wanted him to like her. I actually appreciated how much effort she was putting into connecting with my closest friend. But looking back now, I can see that Isabella was systematically evaluating Carlos as a potential upgrade from me. She was gathering intelligence about his financial situation, his personality, his weaknesses. She was positioning herself as the sophisticated, desirable woman who appreciated successful men and the finer things in life. The relationship ended about 2.5 years ago when I finally couldn't ignore what it was costing me financially and emotionally. I'd accumulated over $15,000 in credit card debt trying to keep up with Isabella's expectations, and I was working overtime constantly just to afford our lifestyle. I didn't feel like a boyfriend anymore. I felt like an ATM with a heartbeat, valued only for what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. When I tried to have an honest conversation with Isabella about scaling back our expenses and finding cheaper ways to enjoy time together, she got angry and defensive. She said I was being cheap and unambitious, that I didn't understand what it took to maintain a relationship with someone of her caliber. She claimed that if I really loved her, I'd find ways to give her what she deserved instead of making excuses about money. That's when I realized Isabella wasn't in love with me. She was in love with the lifestyle she thought I could provide for her. When it became clear that I couldn't sustainably fund her expensive tastes, she started pulling away emotionally and spending less time with me. The breakup happened gradually rather than dramatically. Isabella started canceling dates, claiming she was busy with work projects. She'd be cold and distant during the time we did spend together, constantly checking her phone and seeming distracted. Finally, she said she needed time to find herself and figure out what she really wanted from life. I was devastated, but also secretly relieved. The financial pressure had been crushing me, and I'd started to lose myself trying to become the man I thought Isabella wanted. Carlos was supportive during the breakup, listening to me vent about feeling used and manipulated. He agreed that Isabella had seemed high maintenance and said I was probably better off with someone who appreciated me for who I was rather than what I could buy for them. What I didn't know was that while Carlos was consoling me about my failed relationship, he was also positioning himself as Isabella's next target. The woman who had been evaluating him for months was about to make her move, and my childhood best friend was about to become her willing victim. For nearly a year after Isabella and I broke up, I focused on getting my finances back in order and rebuilding my confidence. I paid down my credit card debt, started saving money again, and began dating women who seemed more interested in genuine connection than expensive dinners. Carlos continued to be supportive during this recovery period, and I thought our friendship had actually grown stronger through the experience. But I started noticing subtle changes in Carlos's behavior about 8 months after my breakup with Isabella. He'd cancel our usual Friday night hangouts with vague excuses about work events or family obligations. When I asked him about his social life, he'd be evasive and change the subject quickly. He seemed distracted during our conversations, constantly checking his phone for messages. I assumed Carlos was dating someone new and being private about it until he felt more serious about the relationship. We'd both been through enough casual relationships that ended badly to understand the value of keeping things quiet until you knew where they were heading. I respected his privacy and figured he'd introduce me to his new girlfriend when he was ready. The truth came out in the most shocking way possible. Nearly a year after my breakup with Isabella, I received an invitation to a surprise engagement party. The invitation was beautifully designed but deliberately vague, just a time, date, and address for the party. No names mentioned, no details about who was getting engaged. I assumed it was for one of our mutual friends or family members. I showed up to the party at an upscale restaurant downtown, dressed nicely and bringing a congratulations card for whoever the happy couple turned out to be. The venue was elegant and expensive, decorated with white flowers and crystal accents. There were about 50 people there, mostly faces I recognized from our shared social circle. Then I saw them. Isabella was standing near the bar, wearing a stunning cocktail dress and a massive diamond engagement ring that caught the light from every angle. She looked even more beautiful than I remembered, glowing with happiness and confidence. And standing beside her, with his arm around her waist and a proud smile on his face, was Carlos, my childhood best friend. The person who had consoled me through the breakup. The man who had agreed that Isabella was high maintenance and manipulative. He was engaged to my ex-girlfriend, and he'd invited me to celebrate their engagement without warning me what I was walking into. The shock was overwhelming. I stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I was seeing. Carlos noticed me first and walked over with Isabella, both of them acting like this was the most natural thing in the world. "Ethan, I'm so glad you could make it," Carlos said, beaming with happiness. "I wanted you to be one of the first to know. Isabella and I are getting married." Isabella smiled sweetly and extended her hand to show me the ring. "I hope you're happy for us, Ethan. I know this might be a little awkward, but Carlos and I just couldn't help falling in love." They acted like I was the outsider in this situation, Like I was the one who should feel awkward about their relationship rather than them feeling guilty about the betrayal. They seemed to expect me to be gracious and supportive, as if my feelings about the situation were irrelevant compared to their happiness. I kept my composure because making a scene wouldn't accomplish anything except embarrassing myself. I congratulated them both, said I wished them happiness, and excused myself from the party as quickly as possible. But inside, I was reeling from the betrayal and trying to understand how this had happened without my knowledge. Over the following weeks, mutual friends filled me in on details that Carlos and Isabella had been carefully hiding. They'd apparently reconnected about 6 months after my breakup, claiming they'd run into each other at a coffee shop and discovered they had feelings for each other. The timeline they were sharing made it sound like a chance encounter that had blossomed into unexpected love. But the more I learned, the more obvious it became that their relationship had been much more calculated than they were admitting. Carlos had been pursuing Isabella almost immediately after our breakup, probably while I was still processing the end of my relationship, and he was pretending to console me. Isabella had clearly identified Carlos as a better financial prospect than me and had been working to transition from one target to the next. Carlos made about double my salary, lived in a luxury condo instead of an apartment, drove a BMW, and took expensive vacations multiple times a year. He was everything Isabella had wanted me to be but couldn't afford to become. The engagement had happened during a weekend trip to Napa Valley that probably cost more than I made in a month. Carlos had rented a private villa, hired a professional photographer, and arranged for champagne and roses. He clearly spared no expense in proposing to the woman who had drained my bank account for 2 years. I tried to reach out to Carlos to have an honest conversation about what had happened between us, but he avoided my calls and messages. When I finally cornered him at a mutual friend's birthday party, he was defensive and dismissive about my concerns. "Isabella and I fell in love," he said. "What happened between you two is in the past. You broke up almost a year ago, so I don't understand why you're making this about you." He claimed their relationship was completely separate from my history with Isabella and that I was being unreasonable by questioning his decision to marry her. He said he'd found someone who appreciated him and shared his ambitions, and that I should be happy for both of them instead of holding grudges about ancient history. That conversation showed me that Carlos had completely bought into Isabella's narrative about our relationship. She'd probably told him that I'd been the problem, too cheap, too unambitious, too unwilling to treat her the way she deserved. She positioned herself as the victim of my inadequacy rather than the manipulator who had drained my resources for her own benefit. Carlos thought he was proving that he could handle Isabella better than I had. He was proud of being able to afford the lifestyle she wanted, and he saw her happiness with him as validation that he was more successful and sophisticated than me. His ego was wrapped up in being the man who could give Isabella everything she'd been missing in our relationship. What Carlos didn't realize was that Isabella had been playing a much longer game than either of us understood. She hadn't randomly encountered him at a coffee shop. She'd been strategically positioning herself to move from me to him when the time was right. And now that she'd successfully made the transition, she was about to begin phase 2 of her plan. Carlos and Isabella's wedding happened about 10 months after their engagement, and it was every bit as extravagant as I would have expected knowing Isabella's tastes. They had the ceremony at a luxury resort about 2 hours outside the city, with about 150 guests, a full orchestra, premium open bar, and designer flowers everywhere. The photos on social media showed crystal chandeliers, gold accents, and Isabella in a wedding dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. I didn't attend the wedding, obviously, but mutual friends filled me in on the details. The ceremony was beautiful but felt more like a business investment than a celebration of love. Isabella had invited numerous wealthy contacts from her professional network, turning the reception into a networking opportunity disguised as a wedding celebration. Carlos looked happy in the wedding photos, but I could see the strain around his eyes that suggested the financial pressure was already getting to him. The wedding alone probably cost $60,000 or more, and I knew he'd taken on significant debt to make Isabella's dream wedding happen. Their honeymoon was a 3-week tour of Europe, hitting all the most expensive cities and luxury hotels. Isabella documented every meal, every shopping trip, every designer purchase on her social media accounts. Carlos looked increasingly uncomfortable in the later photos, especially when Isabella was modeling new jewelry and clothes she bought during their travels. When they returned from the honeymoon, Carlos's lifestyle underwent a dramatic transformation. He moved out of his modest condo and into a luxury high-rise downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and premium amenities. He traded his BMW for a brand new Mercedes and started wearing expensive watches and designer clothes. Isabella had also quit her marketing job to focus on building her personal brand and exploring entrepreneurial opportunities. She claimed that Carlos's success meant she could finally pursue her passion projects without worrying about a steady paycheck. Carlos seemed proud that he was successful enough to support a wife who didn't need to work. But the lifestyle upgrades came with a price tag that was clearly straining Carlos's finances. He stopped suggesting expensive group activities when we occasionally hung out, and he looked tired and stressed all the time. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. Through mutual friends, I heard that Carlos had maxed out several credit cards and taken out loans against his retirement accounts to fund their new lifestyle. Isabella had convinced him that they needed to live up to his professional status and make investments in their image that would pay off in his career advancement. She'd also been pressuring Carlos to ask for a promotion at work, claiming he was being undervalued by his company. She'd done research on compensation in his industry and thought he should be making significantly more money. When Carlos expressed anxiety about the financial pressure, Isabella would remind him that successful men found ways to provide for their families rather than making excuses. The most telling change was in Carlos's social behavior. He used to be the guy who picked up tabs and organized expensive group trips. Now he was making excuses about being too busy to join social events or suggesting cheaper alternatives when he did participate. The confident, generous person I'd known since childhood was becoming anxious and withdrawn under the pressure of maintaining Isabella's lifestyle expectations. About 8 months into their marriage, I heard through friends that Isabella had been spending a lot of time at networking events and social gatherings without Carlos. She claimed he was too busy with his demanding job, but people who saw her at these events said she seemed to be actively cultivating relationships with other successful men. She was always perfectly dressed and charming at these gatherings, collecting business cards and scheduling follow-up meetings with potential business partners. She'd started talking about launching her own consulting company and was meeting with investors and advisors to discuss funding opportunities. What became clear to me, though apparently not to Carlos, was that Isabella was already planning her exit strategy. She'd identified the optimal time frame for maximizing her divorce settlement and was systematically preparing for the end of their marriage while continuing to drain Carlos's resources. In our state, spousal support calculations are influenced by the length of the marriage, with significant benefits starting at the 12-month mark. Isabella had been researching divorce law and asset division rules, positioning herself to claim that she'd sacrificed her career to support Carlos's professional advancement. The timing became obvious when Isabella started documenting her contributions to Carlos's success. She saved emails where she'd given him career advice, took photos of herself at work events that could demonstrate her networking value, and kept records of household management tasks that could be valued as unpaid labor. She also began subtly undermining Carlos's confidence and creating documentation of emotional distress. She'd start fights about money and record his frustrated responses. She'd claim he was becoming controlling and unsupportive when he expressed concerns about their spending. She was building a case for emotional damage that could be used to justify higher spousal support payments. Carlos was completely oblivious to Isabella's strategic planning. He thought her moodiness and distance were just stress from adjusting to married life and building her new business. He kept working longer hours and taking on more debt to fund her lifestyle, believing that his financial sacrifices were investments in their future together. But Isabella's future plans didn't include Carlos beyond the point where he'd served his purpose. She'd successfully transitioned from draining my modest resources to extracting maximum value from his much larger income and assets. Now she was preparing to cash out at the optimal moment while leaving him with the debt and financial damage she'd created. The 12-month mark was approaching, and Isabella was about to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly she'd planned every step of this process. Right around their first wedding anniversary, Isabella executed her exit strategy with surgical precision. She filed for divorce claiming irreconcilable differences and immediately moved out of their luxury condo into a temporary apartment that she claimed was all she could afford on her own. Her divorce filing was a masterpiece of strategic manipulation. She claimed that she'd sacrificed her marketing career to support Carlos's professional advancement and manage their household. She documented the income she'd given up by leaving her job and calculated the value of her unpaid domestic labor during their marriage. Most cleverly, Isabella claimed that Carlos had become emotionally abusive and controlling as his career stress increased. She presented evidence of arguments they'd had about money, taking his financial concerns out of context to make him seem unreasonable and unsupportive. She'd recorded phone conversations where Carlos sounded frustrated about their debt and spending, editing them to make him appear verbally abusive. Isabella's lawyer argued that she deserved substantial spousal support because she'd been financially dependent on Carlos and needed time to rebuild the career she'd abandoned for their marriage. They claimed she was entitled to maintain the lifestyle she'd become accustomed to during their brief marriage. Carlos was blindsided by the divorce filing and the aggressive nature of Isabella's financial demands. He'd thought they were going through a rough patch that could be worked out through counseling or better communication. He had no idea that Isabella had been systematically planning their divorce since almost the beginning of their marriage. The divorce proceedings revealed the full extent of the financial damage Isabella had caused. Carlos had accumulated over $80,000 in credit card debt, emptied his retirement accounts, and taken out a second mortgage on his condo to fund their lifestyle. He'd also co-signed for Isabella's luxury car and several business loans that she claimed were for her consulting company. Isabella's lawyers argued that the debts were marital obligations that should be split equally, while the assets they'd accumulated during the marriage should be divided according to each person's contributions. Since Isabella claimed to have contributed unpaid labor and career sacrifice, she argued she deserved a larger share of their assets. The settlement negotiations were brutal for Carlos. Isabella's legal team was aggressive and well-prepared, while Carlos had hired a cheaper attorney who was overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. Isabella had spent months documenting her claims and preparing evidence, while Carlos was scrambling to understand what was happening to him. In the end, Isabella got almost everything she'd been planning for. She received monthly spousal support payments of $3,500 for 3 years, plus a lump sum payment of $40,000 for her alleged career sacrifice. She kept the luxury car, got half the value of the condo, and was absolved of responsibility for most of the credit card debt. Carlos was left with the mortgage payments on a condo he could no longer afford, monthly spousal support obligations that consumed most of his salary, and crushing credit card debt that would take years to pay off. He'd also developed a reputation at work for being distracted and unreliable during the divorce proceedings, which hurt his chances for advancement. The financial stress became overwhelming, and Carlos started making mistakes at work that eventually cost him his job. His performance had suffered during the divorce, and his employer decided he was no longer worth the problems he was creating. Losing his income while still having spousal support obligations put him in an impossible financial position. Within 6 months of the divorce being finalized, Carlos had to sell his condo at a loss and move back in with his parents. He was 32 years old, broke, bitter, and living in his childhood bedroom while paying monthly support to his ex-wife who had systematically destroyed his life. Isabella, meanwhile, had achieved exactly what she'd been planning from the beginning. She used her divorce settlement and spousal support payments to fund a comfortable lifestyle while she searched for her next target. She'd essentially been paid $40,000 plus 3 years of monthly support for 1 year of marriage to someone she'd never loved. I heard through mutual friends that Isabella had already started dating again, focusing on older divorced men with established wealth who might be looking for younger companionship. She learned from her experience with Carlos and was refining her approach for future relationships. Carlos tried to reach out to me several times during his divorce proceedings, apparently hoping I could provide emotional support or testimony about Isabella's character. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him after what he'd done to our friendship. He'd chosen to pursue my ex-girlfriend behind my back, and now he was experiencing the consequences of that decision. The last time I saw Carlos was at a mutual friend's wedding about 6 months after his divorce was finalized. He looked terrible, thin, tired, wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit properly. He tried to approach me to talk, but I wasn't interested in rehashing old wounds or providing comfort for his self-inflicted problems. Carlos had thought he was proving that he could handle Isabella better than I could. He'd been proud of his ability to provide the lifestyle she wanted and had seen her happiness with him as validation of his superior success and sophistication. His ego had made him the perfect victim for someone who specialized in exploiting male competitiveness and financial insecurity. The irony was perfect. Carlos had rescued me from Isabella's financial manipulation by taking her off my hands before she could do more damage to my life. If he hadn't pursued her, I might have been the one facing an $80,000 divorce settlement and spousal support payments. His betrayal had actually saved me from a much worse fate. Looking back, I realized that Isabella had probably been evaluating Carlos as a potential upgrade from the moment she met him. She'd used our relationship to get close to him and assess his financial situation, then executed a careful plan to transition from one victim to the next when the timing was right. Isabella had been running a sophisticated long-term con game, and Carlos had been her most profitable target. His attempt to prove he was better than me had made him the perfect mark for someone whose only skill was identifying and exploiting successful men's weaknesses. In the end, Carlos got exactly what he deserved, not because I wanted revenge, but because he'd chosen to involve himself with someone whose entire relationship strategy was based on financial manipulation and calculated betrayal. Sometimes karma doesn't need any help from you. Sometimes you just need to step back and watch people destroy themselves with their own poor choices and arrogance.